Age of the Pyrrhic. Ask any historian this era and their expression will immediately sour. As it was one of the most brutal ages, there was, and at the same time, a turning point for most civilizations on the continent. It was a time of new discoveries being used in one of the bloodiest wars there ever was. It was a time of politics and turmoil that shaped perspectives from thousands of years ago to today, spanning around 10 years itself. To understand what began the age of the Pyrrhic, one has to understand the geography of the land at the time and why having dominion over it was so imperative. The mountain range between what is modern Valoria and Nordland is known as the Giant's Range, and is home to a series of underground caverns, high spires, and plentiful valleys. The southern fields of Giant's Range, which is located in present-day northern Valeria, known as the Golden Gate, hosts the Grand River collectively known as the Prism, due to its splitting off akin to when a light hits a prism. This land is incredibly ideal for hosting life. After all civilizations require some kind of water source, be it by river or by sea. Though, to equate this war to being caused by a river would be greatly underestimating the political climate and wants at the time. All elves come from the Ethereum, and there are few exposed parts of it, including something known as the primordial Everforge, which is deep within the highest reaching mountain on the Giant's Range, known as the Heaven Summit. Whilst the Wood Elves and the Dark Elves cared not about the ancestral claim to this bounty, the High Elves believed it belonged to them, considering that it was the kiln of their collective races. Now, it was in control of the Mountain Dwarves, due to the Elves agreeing to break off from something that began twisting and denying them their own life. They believed that if the Dwarves relied on the primordial Everforge, they too would become twisted and mad with power. The High Elves sent ambassadors from Dawnspire, their capital city, to the Everforge and found in great horror that not only did the dwarves find a way to utilize the kiln of the elves' creation to create fantastical weapons and armor, but had even built their capital city there, Asladan, more specifically around the kiln. In great fear, the ambassador, Pyrrhic Uldaria, pointed out what had caused the elves to become as divided as they were, and with genuine sympathy as it was written, he expressed to the Mountain King, Gildan Goldmane, that if they continued to use the Forge without having the powers of the elves to negate the side effects, that the Everforge would become one day unstable. He explained that those dedicated to the Everforge would want to be given a pilgrimage to understand their natural potency with magic and the Aetherium alike. The Mountain King stroked his long and blonde beard, but his face soured at the prospect and eventual reality that something had elevated their people greatly could be used in such a way. King Goldmane did agree to allowing the elves to perform pilgrimages to the kiln, but refused them direct access. In their pride, they stated that their glory days were over, and that they too had their price to pay because of it. Ambassador Uldaria was stunned by this response, but respectfully nodded his head. In truth, he feared the wrath of his liege, King Famarasane Dawnspire. No doubt, with the pride and wrath of these two kings, their scream match would have stood the test of time. However, something had occurred to Pyrrhic. What could King Goldmane possibly mean by having their own price to pay? So, the brave ambassador inquired, and two dwarves descended into the shadows and threw out a puppet made out of wood with runes inscribed to the back of its head and spine. These runes were capable of withholding souls and memories alike. The High Elves had been taking the memory and souls of dwarves, and any other kind alike to sculpt puppets capable of doing tasks the elves did not wish to do, and for the longest while this was one of their greatest secrets. The dwarves were not foolish, as they knew to why their skilled craftsmen and laborers were starting to lose their memory on the border of Khazad-dûm. After all, it shared the borders at the Golden Gate with El Furil. The ambassador gasped upon realizing what had been occurring all this time, for he was not aware there was memory thievery involved in the creation of what felt like programmed servants. The Mountain King did not allow him time to process this, speaking from his throne thereafter. "Return to your king and tell him that he will never see his kiln, for it belongs to those that have need of it, not to gawk and bask at it like some treasure. Greedy fools, you lot. Take and take and take. Tell your king as well that if he does not act his position, we will take his crown too!" Ambassador Oldaria, alas, was thrown out of the mountain hall and into the freezing upper reaches of Heaven's summit, now without an escort to bring him back down. In the south, however, there was a different story. The humans began breaking free from their weakness, flanked by long-living races and recovering from being one of the easiest to deal with due to the human race being heavily divided by clans and tribes. There were those who began making kingdoms, or tried to, in lieu of this punishing world. The Valorian humans had turned their heads to a new ruler, a man going by only the name of Valerius. It was a man who came with holy words of daylight upon his tongue, the bravery of 10,000 men, and the justice that mankind had long since tried to seek as the former superpowers of the world tried to dominate them time and time again. The mountain dwarfs separated the Valorians from reuniting with their northern brothers and sisters, whilst the high elves were stubborn and stole their brethren at night and mocked the humans for being so weak. The king, however, would vow to make humanity weak no longer. The new king, Valerius, recently crowned, had stepped up and proven to his people that they were worthy of strength and freedom. Their settlements at this time were rather sparse, human clans that but roamed the verdant fields of the middling of Illyria, as they called it. While many races had different names to the main continent, the Valorian humans referred to this part as Illyria, and their vast province between the mountains and others, Valoria, named, of course, after the king that guided them to seek freedom. He had united the human clans and kingdoms and tribes, and began pushing towards becoming an actual force to be dealt with through unity. Armies were formed, garrisons were placed. The king also established a common law, known as the Holy Creed, a list of rules, laws, and edicts to ensure unity, trust, and honor among people in the name of the Holy Light. The Valorian humans banded together to push back against threats such as the undead, the ravaging orcs, and anything that would dare oppress them. Before long, their military prowess began to rival the other powers. However, they were not the only ones in Illyria who sought for peace. The outer-bound wood elves were always a teacher for the human clans learning how to hunt, and found themselves having good relations with the Valorian humans even prior to becoming Valorian. King Valerius was overjoyed to have companions such as the Wood Elves, who were innovators and knew how to keep the wilderness safe and tended to. For their kindness in teaching humans so many of their lessons, King Valerius allowed their allies to be welcome into his kingdom. Wood Elves and humans, by his law, would live side by side. However, the king was rather surprised the elves were so genuinely forgiving, considering that the human clans had a knack for trying to invade their forests. When asked why they were so eager to simply shrug their shoulders and merely ignore the invasions, the wood elves all laughed and pointed backwards as if they were talking about someone behind them. In this translated letter, the wood elves stated, "Dear humans, we are not a spiteful kind, at least not all of us are. The inner-bound Sylvan are hugged close to the font of life and believe that they are our word and law. We believe in a few things, that time shall mend wounds, that the world deserves to be held and whole, and that the inner-bound can take their tyrannical selves far elsewhere from us. We protect what cannot be touched, and as long as it is understood that some parts of this world are sacred, then we are in agreement that the clans of old simply vying for a home, not theirs, can be looked over. King Valerius could not deny that he did have intent to try and take over Kerdwig Yuval for his own people, but he was also a man to express that the light had decreed that what he has is enough, and that if the Holy Light bid it so, that they will be given an ample opportunity to act upon it. Some of the Wood Elves had become rather intrigued with the concept of the Holy Creed, and while they were not against it per se, they did have their own lines that did not include sainthood. This began the start of seeding of the Holy Creed being spread amidst the Wood Elves. This soon beckoned its own crusade. However, this would be far later, beyond this current age of the Pyrrhic. Suffice to say, this created a healthy alliance between the Valorian humans and the Wood Elves, where they would promise to aid each other in efforts of innovation and protection. The High Elves and Innerbound referred to the Outerbound as weaklings that relied too heavily on allies. This alliance would allow them more than just protection from what was to come. South of Kerdwig Yuval, and through the deserts to Askar, branched a trade route established called the Emerald Road, which is how the Askar began to disperse spice and information, alchemy in particular, which became a prime tenet of life magic itself. The Askar were much more hands-off with the Valorians and began seeing them as a possible threat, and felt that establishing this road meant that they could take advantage of a rapid expansion. All the while, the Hill Dwarves began showing their faces in Valoria City. They were rather isolated from the other races, but were content to show their ways to those interested, taking heavy grudges with those who had tried to take advantage of them before. Though, to see a society much keener upon uniting instead of just blatant conquering, even if it meant that the humans would take the forefront of the stage, it brought them at least sincere joy to see some semblance of order and peace be brought to Middle Illyria. Their oracles told of a time where all hands would be wet with blood, however. And it was what they did with that blood that would determine the outcome of the future. The shamanistic ways of the Hill Dwarves and the nature-abiding ways of the Wood Elves made these two races half a continent apart allies and friends, and thusly did they exchange many goods and many secrets alike. The Hill Dwarves approached the Outerbound and showed them gunpowder, albeit to them at the time it was something of a sunset dust on account of the explosions it caused, looking almost like a sunset. A double meaning in dwarven poetry where the sun sets. It means the end of a narrative theme. The Outerbound were intrigued by this, and took the portion of it to their own people with the knowledge of how to source it. Both parties kept it a secret from the humans, who might as well find it on their own. The humans, of course, eventually did find out. Of course, they always do. Some the next leg up, even. This secret did not upset the humans, as Valerius was firm in his belief that the elves and dwarves of their alliance were doing so in good faith, and wanted to make sure the humans were fine. Valerius was keen to show the alliance the true willpower of humanity, after all. The Innerbound spy network spanned across the continent of Valyria, and the Emerald Road managed to peek its way into middle sections of Kerdwig Yuval. And where there is information, there is fortune. And the Innerbound were incredibly interested in the idea of alchemy, buying out alchemists and their tomes to live in luxury in the Innerbound capital of Yggdrasil. The Innerbounds were the guardian of the font of life, but also were masters of twisting the idea of life magic in every which way. One would consider that those who had absolute reverence for life would not go so far as necromancy, or the more manipulative-esque magics. However, whilst they have respect for it, they also have the ego and belief that they should not only have mastery over life, but death. A note about the Innerbound is that they operate through the whims of isolationism, and using their unique knowledge for trade that is specific to them. Now, they had alchemy under their belt, and established a fairly decent, albeit secretive, trade route with the Askar. The main Emerald Road went around a small mountain and split off south of Valoria City and into the outerbound regions of Pyrrhic. The secret route was a seaside lane that ran across the west of the mountain and through one of the more jagged coasts, which had its own myriad of issues and forced the Askar and the Innerbound to make outposts along the way. Due to this cutting into part of their territory, the outerbound Sylvanar became quite worried at what this possibly could have meant. Something was changing and the outerbound began to arm themselves. It was not that the outerbound were adverse to outsiders, but more so the fact that the innerbound typically were the ones that detested outside influence. Whilst these technological advances were happening, the kings of the giant rangers were greatly displeased. The high elves were denied their birthright, and even moderation of the very kiln that they made for the sake of safety. And the mountain dwarves had found out why so many of their people's souls were going missing. On top of that, the king of the mountain dwarves had threatened the high elves. The start of the war began at the Golden Gate, and both forces had their best on the field, and at first to outsiders, this seemed like something that would be over really soon. Ultimately, however, these two races were the most stubborn of their kind, and the battles would go on without rest, some territories being taken, some being claimed back. Constant pushes back and forward ultimately put the conflict into an endless stalemate, or so it seemed. Yet it felt as if the more that either side was slain, the more appeared. The two kingdoms were perplexed, and suddenly a voice reached out to the kings, offerings of something called necroalchemy. While part of alchemy was about ascending the soul to new heights, necroalchemy was about dominating a soul, and binding it instead of releasing it further to find enlightenment. All they needed were those defined by having a great soul. Heroes, villains, demons, spirits, anything capable and having renown behind their name, fantastic warriors that were obedient to a fault. They would have their alchemists teach necroalchemy to the high elves and to the mountain dwarves. This was, oddly, not as self-serving of the innerbound. The idea was that the army, what was referred to as necromachines, would return to Yggdrasil and would be used to wipe out the outerbound, and to have control of the rest of the land as they felt they were getting too far ingenious with their newest technology. The innerbound themselves, however, were the ones that had just unleashed a new tool of absolute doom. And so their allies went out, summoned demons, summoned heroic spirits from their resting places, killed existing heroes, or strapped poor spirits in armor and bound them to a purpose. They were beings of metal, magic, and sinew, and their introduction into the battlefield proper on both sides caused the rivers to quite literally run red with how many bodies were being found in it. These tall and immense machines were coating the giants' range in corpses, and worst of it all, both sides began losing control over them. The thing about alchemy, it is written, is that there is a routine-based ascension to the road of enlightenment. One must continuously curate their soul. As for the opposite of it, one must have continued domination and episodes of breakage in order to prevent the soul from breaking free. And it did not take long for the necromachines to realize that their hands were soaked with prophetic blood. These giants of metal and iron that stood at 10 or even 12 feet turned around and began killing those that commanded them, slaying their masters and seeking out whoever may have brought them to this fate. There were also those necromachines that dedicated their lives to finding the more hellish and unnatural machines that were running rampant, themselves now demons with new forms that were now stronger than even before their fate. They were now unnaturally powerful and began the campaign across Illyria. The more valorous necromachines, however, confronted these demonic machine horde in the mountains. In particular, was it in an isolated field of flowers. Academics and cartographers have since labeled this land as the Fields of Gibraltar. the total number of necromachines went from 1,000 approximately to less than 200 in the whole world. Some were slain by the High Elves, or the Mountain Dwarves. Some, however, were slain by their own ilk and make. Very few necromachines remained, and the majority of them fled into the wilderness to become isolated heroes or villains alike. Whilst this battle raged on between necromachines, the rivers of the prison began to grow more dangerous. The culmination of all the violence from the conflict had poisoned the water and allowed a new plague to breed from within it. This plague, whomever it afflicted, would wither them down until they were nothing but an undead husk, seeking the obliteration of all that lived. At this time, Valerius, receiving this news, had decided that enough was enough. Calling the banners of all the houses, tribes, and factions that had united behind him, he marched north and pinched the forces with unseen tactics. The weakened armies were forced into a retreat and ended up conceding land. They gave up the Golden Gate as their numbers were too thinned out. Even villages that once bustled with life were now empty and reduced to rubble. Seeing the scar upon the land from this primordial blight, Valerius raised his blade to the heavens and presented it to the heavens alone, declaring aloud, "Come, sons and daughters of the gods, look upon what you have done. The bounty of life squandered over petty rivalries, and now all of our children shall weep as they shake and turn grey. For your bloodshed, your hatred, your corpses that bled out screaming were their seedbeds of decay. Hearken to me, O heavens divide! Grant me the strength to dispel the weakness from the earth, for I am Illyria's emperor henceforth, and if the gods deny me, then let silence speak their truth, for I know that they shall answer me." And he was right. The clouds that had not left the battlefield cracked open as a warm and loving ray of light descended upon the Golden Gate, a light not seen in years. The grass had returned was as gold as honey. Bodies faded into golden embers that were carried by the wind, and the water that was once lifeless and blighted was now gold and glittering like glass through a cathedral. The Emperor of Illyria had spoken, and with the might of the gods on his side, did the age of Pyrrhic come to a close. The Valorian humans say that Emperor Valerius was a god himself, whilst others argue that he was sent to deliver a golden age to humankind. He died peacefully on his throne, far beyond when he was supposed to, 130 years later. But humanity was, at least in the eyes of the Valerians, united at last. And he had shown the world the power of absolute light. The people of Illyria, human or not, began taking to the Holy Creed to heart and abiding by its rules. For some, this would spell freedom. But for others, this was the beginning of a new age, of twisted ideologies in a world now bereft of heroes. The Hill Dwarves' prophecy somewhat became correct, ultimately. Many were slain just to make a necromachine. The outerbound wood elven courts had been decimated in search of great souls and had to ultimately recover. Emperor Valerius soon after became canonized as the first saint upon death, and became known as the King of Saints and mankind. All the kings that have now come after would bow their head to his creed, and later on, all of its warped versions.